Recently, we've seen footage out of the UK showing that members of the ruling party, staffers of the ruling party during COVID, were actually actively, knowingly, willfully breaking COVID rules. This is something we've seen in Australia as well, of course, but this is clearly not a problem confined to Australia, as this recent video shows. My guest today is Alex Story. He's a UK political commentator, former Olympic rower, and someone that we received amazing feedback on last time we had you on, Alex. People saying they didn't want the interview to end. The longer it went for, the better it got. So it's my absolute pleasure to have you back on the Aussie Wire here today, Alex. What do you make of these so-called revelations? I'm not sure that they were revelations at all. I'll just play some video here. This is well-known video now. The Mirror are the ones that put it online where I found it. This is very well-known video of young staffers playing, having fun during COVID restrictions when they were breaking the rules, and they say in this video that they knew they were breaking the rules. What is the average person to make of this?
I think the first thing we can say about Conservative Party members is that they don't dance very well, but that's not a surprise to anyone either. I mean, one of the things we've also got to say is that the same is true of the Labour Party. We have footage of Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition in the United Kingdom, doing something quite similar. We also have it in Austria. I mean, I remember because I live in Austria. Austria is a small country in Central Europe. And we had the ruling party organizing an Oscar for itself during COVID lockdown. We also have video footage of Sanna Marin in Finland going to nightclubs, snorting an enormous amount of coke, despite the fact that one of her staffers had actually tested for COVID, still going to nightclubs. And because she was a female leader in a socialist party, the entire world defended her. It's a little bit like Black Lives Matter going out, breaching COVID rules and regulation. It doesn't matter because the cause was right.
That's right.
Of course, what's happening there, and this is a really important thing, and this I like to talk about schematics sometimes. What we have is a world of principles and a world of expediency. We have a ruling class that has moved away from principles and it goes for expediency. What that means is that they do the things they want to do without constraints, because they realize that there is no fight back. And the reason for this is because democracy, the ballot box, is no longer relevant as far as they're concerned.
Right.
They think, and they realize that they're quite right in the short term, if they push something through and people are against it, it doesn't matter because they can use the power of the state to coerce people into following their dictates, whether they make sense or not, or whether you and I are protected by ancient constitutional rights matters not a jot. They do not care. What they do not want is constraints. And what we've got to try and do is remind ourselves that morality, which is essentially the bedrock of principles, is what we have to reestablish. And we have to bring these guys back into a state of principles that means constitutional rights, and it means essentially morality. There is a right and there is a wrong. And if you're wrong, you need to be able to pay the price for your wrongdoing.
Now, you've been following politics for quite some time. You've been very, very active for a number of years now. Where do you think this problem started? We're seeing these symptoms. The contrast, the starkness of the problem has really come out during the COVID era. But that's not where the problem started, is it?
I think it started a while back. In the United Kingdom, I think the beginning of the problem started when we signed up to the European Communities Act in 1972, because essentially what happens there was that you can see that in the act, it's a very short act, we subordinate the British Parliaments to the European Commission. In other words, what we're stating is that the British Parliament is no longer sovereign. So we've stripped the population of Britain from its actual vote, and we've said from now on, we have theatre. Beforehand, before 1972-73, who you voted in terms of government made big decisions. After that, it was more cosmetic. The big change to this was when Thatcher got elected, because she made some really big changes. Like a good doctor, she looked at the patient and she said the patient needs to change his diet rather than look for outside reasons why he might be failing. And so as the decade went on, she realized that one of the big blocks for further reform and for further efficiency and dynamism was the European Union, which is partially one of the reasons why she was kicked out by her then Foreign Secretary or former Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe. But actually what we've seen is an increasing draw by elite politicians towards supranational agencies, because the moment you start to attach your political systems to supranational bodies, you're no longer dependent on what the local populace says or wants. You can always say, we would love to do what you guys want, but actually it's against the international treaties that we signed. So our hands are tied. And this is the beginning of the process, which I think in the UK started in the 1970s. Of course, you have all sorts of other treaties that have been signed over the course of time through the United Nations and everything else. But that is essentially a stripping away from the sovereign rights of people to decide how their countries are governed. That's really what we have to look at. A politician who tells you that his hands are constrained because of supranational rules is essentially telling you we don't live in a democracy.
Well, that's the history of that is fascinating. I wasn't aware actually of that particular element of the UK's history. I'm more aware of contemporary history, and certainly what's been looming large in more recent years is this almost unholy alliance between your UN and various UN bodies, other multinational bodies, and of course the topic of the moment is the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab and his particular economic forum. Do you throw them into the same basket as what you're talking about there with the European Union over the UK? Are they trying to do a similar thing on a global scale, do you think?
So sorry that I went back so far. I didn't mean
No,
to,
no,
but
no, no.
actually,
It's good.
I think the important thing is the important thing is to try and link all these things together, because that's essentially a process by which a certain type of elite decides to strip the ordinary citizen from his rights. And of course, what you do by centralizing decision making is that you make it very, very susceptible to lobbying. I remember when I stood for the European Parliament in 2014, I came across the CEO for BP Exploration. He was a chap in charge of a budget of about £10 billion at the time. And he says, Alex, what are you doing? And I went, I'm standing for the European Parliament. And he says, I love Europe. And I said, why is that? And he goes, because they will legislate for me across Europe. I love that. Right. In other words, for him, it was great because he could go straight to Brussels, and for an entire continent, his company would be able to lobby for the regulation it needed. And then I said to him jokingly, what do you think of Switzerland? He goes, an absolute nightmare. And I said, why is that? He goes, well, because I've got to go from canton to canton, and all the plebs locally always vote against me. And that's all right, because what he didn't like is the fact that democracy requires consensus and it requires negotiation. He didn't want to negotiate. And of course, the EU is a regional, essentially, replica of what the UN is. And so what you have is the very powerful companies that come together in super locations and everything else, and they decide what they want. What they do is that they create massive barriers to entry to competitors, and they create themselves quasi-monopolies. And there is no real reason for them to go away from it, because they benefit hugely from this. And we saw this in COVID, when I think the richest corporations became a third richer. And at the same time, a third of sorry, not a third, but a lot of the smaller and medium-sized companies crashed.
Yeah.
In other words, for them, it was all upside.
Well, we've seen the news come out here in Australia just recently that the demand for food banks and free food for families and for homeless people, etc., in Australia is right now matching the peak of the COVID era. Now, the COVID era itself was a new high. It was a new peak in Australia. Now, we don't have the COVID restrictions anymore. We're in a position where the vast majority of people, not everyone, but most people are able to go back to work, and yet we're seeing the ordinary person on the street having to go and ask for food handouts. And that's obviously a world away from the sorts of people that you're talking about negotiating oil exploration rights on a continental basis. One further question for you, Alex, and this is a question without notice, and I apologise if I'm springing this on you. But given that we have these bodies that are trying to exercise power over this sort of the global area, if not very large regional areas in the case of the EU, what do you make of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship? This, of course, is Lady Philippa Stroud and Jordan Peterson and others who are putting together ostensibly a competitor to the World Economic Forum, a think tank that is designed to put ideas forward that are pro-human. Is that something that you're across and aware of? And do you have any thoughts on where that may lead in this contest of ideas?
Well, yeah, that's I'm very keen on being part of it. I'm hoping that I'll be joining them in September.
Mm,
It's a very important movement. As I said before, we are we're observing as a reaction what has happened to us over the last few years and few months, right? So we are observing that our vote doesn't matter, that ancient constitutions no longer matter
mm,
either,
mm,
and that we as human beings are being taken for granted. It could be a vaccine passports, it could be restrictions on your travel, it could be restrictions on the food that you're eating.
sure.
All of that are things that we're noticing. So we have to take countermeasures. The countermeasure, the strongest that we have, is that this very small group of individuals has actually a very small political footprint.
Mm,
It's not supported by many people. What
mm,
we have on our side is the vastness of humanity.
mm,
And so the Association of Responsible Citizenship is an attempt to remind people that together we can be extremely strong. And unlike communists and socialists, we're not
mm.
seeking to divide. What we're trying to remind people is that they have an inherent value and that
Yeah.
their voices ought to be heard. So the Association of Responsible Citizenry is not a political statement. It's
Mm,
not about rising or lowering taxes.
mm,
It's really about reminding people that they have inherent value. If we can get people to start thinking in this way and create resistance nodes wherever we are, I think
mm.
there's a good chance that we might be able to win, or at least topple this giant with clay feet.
Mm. I love the Wizard of Oz analogy. I think of it often. It certainly was the case here in Australia with COVID. As soon as you saw behind the curtain, everything became completely ridiculous. And I suspect the same is going to be true of the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and a lot of these paper tigers that they've created in our minds. I'll actually be in the UK for the inaugural ARC event in October, November. And hopefully I'll see you there, Alex, and look forward to catching up with you. But for now, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.